and it now falls to me to welcome our guest speaker this evening. Worshipful brother Paddy Langdown comes all the way to us today from the dark side, as it were, East Kent, but he's very kindly to come and give us, kindly agreed to come and give us an insight to his fascinating career as the captain of one of the world's most iconic aircraft. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I give you worshipful brother Captain Paddy Langdown, formerly of the RAF. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The only mistake you made there is I've got the lights on, so it's not the dark side tonight. Well, good evening, everybody. Now, I know that some of you have heard this presentation before, so you may go to sleep, but please don't snore without your microphone muted, and that especially applies to worshipful brother Alan Rule and Wally Freeman, if he's there. Please forgive me if I make any mistakes tonight, because although I've done this talk about 135 times, this is the first one I've done on Zoom. So I'm not very confident that it'll go smoothly. My presentation has 4 movie clips, 3 of which are in colour. The one in black and white has poor sound, so I apologise for that in advance. Now, the talk is divided very roughly into 4 parts. Why and how the Vulcan came into being, a bit about the crew, a bit about the story of XH558, which many of you have seen was the last flying Vulcan that actually stopped flying at the end of 2015, and a bit about the future. And I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end, but I ask you to remember that it is now 44 years, almost to the day, since I last flew in a Vulcan. And my memory is not very good, like I suspect many of yours. And for those of you who don't know me and haven't heard this talk before, I was a Vulcan pilot from 1963 until I retired in 1976. There are 135 or thereabouts Vulcans built, of which 45 were Mark 1s and 90 were Mark 2s. And of those 90, I flew 64 different ones. I actually served on 3 squadrons, but because I was what they call an instrument rating examiner, I flew with 2 others. Now, we are on the screen now, and this is where the story begins. And I hope you made a note of that, Daniel. Anybody's phone goes off. Right, the story begins in 1945 over Hiroshima, shortly followed by Nagasaki. Now, what many of you don't know, I'll go back one there for a moment. What many of you don't know is that a lot of the research work on these atom bombs was carried out in the United Kingdom. And in those days, we were very good friends with the Americans, and we used to share all our information with them. But when it actually came to dropping them and testing them, the Americans were very cagey, and they wouldn't share the information they learned back with us. So there's the 2 bombs going off in Japan. Well, that's one of the 2 bombs. Shortly afterwards, Winston Churchill coined the phrase that an iron curtain is descending across Europe, because the Russians were a bit disturbed at these bombs, and it was at the end of the war, and they started building things like the Berlin Wall and spying on us and getting the secrets that the Americans didn't want to share. When it came to testing the bombs, though, although a lot of work had been done in the UK, it was felt that testing them under the streets of Manchester was not a very good idea. And so they tested them under the sands of Nevada. Some of you, of course, being Liverpool supporters, may disagree with that, but that was the way it was. So the USA at the end of the war decided to go it alone. Churchill was voted out, Attlee was voted in, And believe it or not, it was the Labour government that decided that we should have our own atomic bomb. Churchill then coined the phrase, the Iron Curtain was descending across Europe. The Russians wouldn't talk to us anymore. And so we developed the bomb ourselves. Now, the only problem was that we were very good at developing bombs, but we hadn't got a state-of-the-art bomber with which to drop it. The best bomber we had at the time was the Lancaster, which wouldn't fly very fast. It wouldn't fly very high. It had a decent range, but not enough to get to Moscow and back. And we did see that Moscow was going to be, or Russia was going to be, our next enemy. Now, I think I've got a picture here of the first bomb. Right. The Ministry of Supply Spec 35 of 1946 identified the need for a new strategic bomber, and it had to be high altitude, long range, and very fast in comparison with what we had at the time. The ceiling was going to be 50,000 feet. Now, the only thing that flew at 50,000 feet in those days were photo reconnaissance fighters like strip-backed Spitfires and Mosquitoes. Speed had to be 600 miles an hour plus, and that had only been achieved at that stage in a dive. The range had to be 4,000 miles, and the only thing that could fly 4,000 miles or thereabouts would be something like a Sunderland or a Catalina flying boat. And it had to carry 11,000 pounds of bombs. And that was the reason why. We developed Blue Danube, 20,000 tons of high explosive equivalent, 24 feet long, as it says here, 6 feet 2 in diameter and weighing 5 tons. Now, a Lancaster could, if adapted, carry one of those, but that was the only thing it could do. It couldn't do anything the other things. So Spec 35 of 46 identified the need and was sent out to all the major big heavy bomber manufacturers, AV Rowe, Vickers, Handley Page, Short Brothers and Harland of Belfast and so on. And the three most successful were the Vulcan, the Victor and the Valiant. Now the Valiant is in the middle, the Victor at the top, and the first Vulcans, the Mark I, at the bottom. I usually start with the Valiant because that was the first into service and it was probably the most traditional of the three. Sadly, because they built it so fast and because they built it just after the war, it is my personal considered opinion that the quality of the steel and so on that they used was not as good as it could have been. If any of you had things like Vauxhalls at the end of the war, they used to be called rust buckets. And I think that's what happened with the Valiant, because it had only been in service a few years and it started falling to pieces. Not very popular with the pilots because of that, although it was a popular airplane to fly. So it was the first into service and the first out. It was actually scrapped in 1964. The Victor was a good bomber, that's the Victor at the top, was a good bomber, but after the American Gary Powers was shot down in his U-2 over Russia at a height never before had anything been shot down at, and I'm not sure what it was, but it was about 60,000 feet, I think. It was decided that the remaining V-bombers, the Victor and the Vulcan, would fly low level over Russia. Victors were then not very good at this because the design of the aircraft made them not quite as strong as the V shape of the Vulcan, so they were converted to in-flight refueling. Now they were good bombers and they had a good bomb load, but because they were not very good at low level, or not as good at low level, and converted to in-flight refueling, they were very much more successful at that. The Vulcan was inherently the strongest. So, moving on. In 1953, which those of you who are old enough will remember was coronation year, the viewers or the audience at Farnborough were treated to a multicolour Vulcan flypast. Now, the two aircraft in the middle are Mark I Vulcans. The two aircraft at the top, I think, are Avro 707B, and the two at the bottom were Avro 707A, I think. Nobody's been able to confirm it for me. But the four little aircraft were just built to test the aerodynamics of this new V-shaped aeroplane. 2 high speed and 2 low speed. And if you remember, as I say, it was coronation year, red, white and blue, very patriotic, and they flew past like that. And I was there. So we move on a little. In 1955, and this is the one that is not very good, the sound, Rowley Falk, Avro's test pilot, treated the crowd to this on takeoff. It wasn't jerky like this, it was a smooth barrel roll, and it surprised the crowd because they'd never seen a heavy bomber do this before, and it just went to show how aerobatic and how easy to handle this aircraft was. Now that's the one with very poor sound. Well, it's gone on longer than I've ever seen it go on before. But there we are. That was 1955. Let me tell you something about Rowley Falk. He was their test pilot, and sadly at that flight he stressed the aircraft and he was told not to do it again. But he was a strange man who always flew in a suit, and he had his trilby hat on board so that when he landed, he was really ready and smartly dressed to perform his primary role, which they employed him for, as a salesman. But sadly, he was not allowed to sell the Vulcan. It was too secret. In 1956, we were treated to another.
The world's biggest delta. Futuristic giant. At Farnborough, this aircraft too gets into the aerobatic act. The lab's bombing technique is demonstrated over again. The huge delta loops, and then half rolls, elephantine but efficient. A glimpse of secrets, the new standoff bomb carried under a Vulcan.
Now, the aircraft actually performs, as you can see there, more like a fighter than a bomber, and is truly responsive to the pilot's demands. The commentator calls her elephantine, but that's the last word I would use. At height, this aircraft will outfly any of the state-of-the-art fighters that we had at the time. Really beautiful. Under the aircraft there, you can see a standoff bomb, and we'll have more on that later. Now, training was going on. We've got the bombs, and we've got the aircraft. So we now have the squadrons, and here you'll see the first squadron, which was 83 Squadron, formed at Waddington in the late 50s, late 50s rather. Now you'll see here that it is guarded by 2 policemen and 1 police dog. I always claim that this was before Greenpeace was invented, and that was all we needed. You'll also notice that these aircraft are painted white, which meant that they were high level intention at that time, and they don't have any in-flight refueling screens. In-flight refueling probes, because at that time they weren't intended to do in-flight refueling. That came in the early 60s. That's an anti-flash white, is supposed to deflect any flash from an atomic explosion if you fly too near. So the crews are training, and at the time, thanks to the American Air Defense Radar Scheme, which was built across the top of Canada, and also one unit at Fylingdales on the North York Moors, which you may have seen if you've been up that way. Looks like a couple of, or 2 or 3 big golf balls. Well, they've got what they call over-the-horizon radar, which could see any intercontinental ballistic missile launched from Russia as soon as it got into the air, and will give the Americans 15 minutes warning of an impending attack. Now, because we're that much nearer, it would have given us 4 minutes warning, which meant we had to run like hell. Now, the crews were trained, and four crews on each nuclear-based bomber station in the UK were kept on 15 minutes standby round the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year, including Christmas. And they were brought down during practices from 15 minutes to 5 minutes, and then 4 minutes, and into the aircraft that had to be airborne within 2 minutes. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the first time that we were brought down to less than 15 minutes. Fortunately, that was just before I started on the V-Force, but they were told then that any warning would be real and not a practice. And I believe that the increased consumption of toilet paper was significant. Right. The aircraft were on specially adapted runways. They built on the end of all the operational stations what we called the Finger 4, which was also known as the QRA pan, the Quick Reaction Alert pan, and 4 aircraft could take off from there in less than, we had to do it, practice and do it in less than 2 minutes. Now, I joined the V-Force in 1963, and it was just before that that a wing commander at Coningsby on 35 Squadron, which was the squadron I was intended to go to, was out practicing at the end of a sortie. He was doing some circuits and bumps, and he landed his aircraft accidentally in the grass just short of the runway. He landed it so hard that one of the wheel bogies, which I'll show you later, fell off, and its second bounce was just over the far side of this Vulcan at the bottom. Now, those aircraft were at the time on standby, which meant that they could possibly, they weren't, but they could have been loaded with atomic weapons. And as you can imagine, it didn't please anybody very much when this wheel flew over the top. I don't think if it had hit anything, it could have caused a nuclear explosion, but it did not frighten them. From that stage, they moved the aircraft off the operational readiness platform back onto the airfield within sort of very short taxiing distance. And when we were really practicing for takeoffs, we would move them back onto the ORP. The wing commander concerned was posted fairly quickly, and he was replaced by, at that time, squadron leader, acting wing commander David B. Craig, who eventually became Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Lord Craig of somewhere, can't remember where, in Norfolk, where he still lives to this day. Now, scrambles were frequently practiced with a target time of 2 minutes for the 4th aircraft to be airborne. All 4 engines could be started with a touch of one button. And after practice, it was frequently achieved in 1 minute and 20 seconds. And I'll show you what it looked like. That is just back.
Attention, attention, this is the bomber controller. For bomb list Sierra, scramble. For bomb list Sierra, scramble.
Now, the observant ones amongst you will have noticed that that was not just one scramble, that was two, but it was to give you a better idea of what happened. You will have also noticed that we were the inventors of pollution, for which I sincerely apologise. So that's the aircraft. And so we now move on to the crew. Now that is an embryo Vulcan pilot. This was him when he was a little more mature, and this is the poor old bugger now. Now the crew consisted of the pilot, the captain, that's me on the left, the co-pilot next, then we had two navigators, a nav radar and a nav plotter, then an air electronics officer and a crew chief. Now, two navigators, because one was the nav radar who could navigate by radar, and the other was the nav plotter whose job it was to use the radar positions and the other positions that were passed to him to plot a time on target at the right time, right height, right direction and everything else. The air electronics officer was intended in times of war to operate all the anti-electronic warfare equipment, and in times of peace he would monitor the aircraft systems and the electrics. Crew chief on the right is an interesting chap. He actually became the Deputy Grand Superintendent in the Holy Royal Arch in Canada. He was a crew chief in the RAF. He decided when he retired that he would work in Canada, a place called Goose Bay, where we used to go to practice. And he liked it so much, when he retired, he applied for a job as the sheriff, and he got it. He was disappointed not to have a horse, but he had a big car. And then he retired to Moncton in Nova Scotia, and sadly died last year. As I say, he was the Deputy Grand Superintendent in the Holy Royal Arch, but I don't think at the time I knew him, he was even a Freemason. Right, so now we've got the aircraft, we've got the weapons, and we've got the crew. What should we do next? I know, let's have a competition against the best in the world, or so they claim. The Americans. Hello, we lost somebody. To make it fair, we'll hold a competition every other year, once in the UK and once in America. And we will let the host country set the rules. So 1974 came around, and it was the Americans' time, and they chose 4 aircraft and crews from the UK to go to a United States Air Force base in northwest Louisiana called Barksdale, just outside Shreveport, some of you may know. And in the 1974, the Americans decided they would make life difficult, and that they would say, okay, chaps, this year we will simulate computer failure. Now, that upset a lot of the Americans, because they were running around like headless chickens saying, what are we going to do without our computers? The Brits were also running around and saying, please somebody, what is a computer? Because we haven't got any. The nearest we had was the Sinclair Scientific Calculator, which at that time in 1974 could be bought from Woolworths for $49.95. You could also get a simplified version a few years later from any petrol station with 4 gallons of petrol, so they weren't that difficult. We did have one significant advantage, and that was that our navigators were born and brought up on simple navigation by shooting the stars, astronavigation. The Americans weren't trained on astronavigation, but our guys could use the sextant, very much like the sextants that they used on the old sailing ships in the times of Nelson. And in a Vulcan, at height, you could get a really first-class position from shooting a star, because the aircraft was very stable, and if you flew it in unaccelerated flight, not going up or down, not going from side to side, and you could get a spot-on position. The nav radar would do the screenshots with the sextant, which clipped onto a periscope rather, on the underside of the cockpit at the top. So it clipped up from underneath onto the roof of the cockpit, and the radar would shoot the stars. He would pass the readings to the nav plotter, who would then use them to find the position. The result of that was that we won the navigation trophy. Now, the trophy's the big one in the middle, and the little ones are miniatures that were handed to each of the crew members to keep. Mine, which is one of those little ones, is now in the officers' mess at RAF Bryce Norton, where the squadron that we were with at the time is now serving. And it comes out on dining in nights and things like that, and sits on the top table. It has pride of place. We flew 2 sorties approaching 5.5 hours each, consisting of a high-level stage, a low-level stage, and another high-level stage. And we dropped a radar bomb, as it were, at the end of the first high-level stage, the low-level stage, and at the end. And we were plotted on the chart, and the one with the combined nearest to the targets for each of those would win the navigation trophy, and the one with the actual nearest to the target with the bombs would take the bombing trophy, and then they had a combined bombing and navigation trophy. Now, we won the navigation trophy, one of the other RAF crews won the bombing trophy, and a third crew won the combined, having got the best overall. The Prime Minister was so surprised that he stopped the proceedings at Westminster to announce that the RAF had beaten the United States Air Force for the first time in navigation, bombing, and overall. And to show his gratitude, he sent me a letter which my then wife handed to me on the tarmac when we got home. And it said, "Dear Flight Lieutenant Langdown, very many congratulations on your achievements in the United States of America. Your services will be no longer required." And that was terminating my career after 18 years in 2 years' time. The short version of my response was 2 letters containing 3 Fs. 2 words containing 3 Fs, I should say. Now, the Vulcan was also modified to carry that standoff weapon that you saw in Farnborough. That was the prototype, and this was a dummy. You can tell it's a dummy because that's Niagara, and the Americans are not very keen about foreign aircraft flying over their country with atomic weapons on board. The idea of that was that we would release this weapon at high level. It would fly 150 miles into Russia and explode on target so that we would be about 300 miles the other way before the bomb went off. That's the idea. What actually happened was that the politicians decided that we would fly to where we were going to fly to at low level and then release it, and we would have a bigger selection of targets open to us further into Russia. Fortunately, I was on aircraft that carried what I would call the traditional atomic weapons, not the blue steel, so I never had the problem. Now, this is a shot of the Vulcan dropping 21 1,000-pound bombs. The only time the aircraft actually did this in anger was in 1982 over the Falkland Islands. Now, the aircraft had been almost completely redundant by 1982, and so they also found they hadn't got any bombs left because we used to use them for practice. They had to raid bomb dump that they could find in the country to find enough bombs to ship out to Ascension Islands, to put on the aircraft, to take them down to the Falklands. The result of that was that the first aircraft to drop bombs on the Falklands was the Vulcan, which dropped 21 bombs, the bottom of these 2 lines, and you can see they're dropped perfectly diagonally across the runway, which means that there are 2 or 3 bombs on the runway rather than dropping them down the side of the runway and they all end up in the mud, because you've only got to be 15 feet off and you've missed the runway altogether. The second attack was the one at the top where all the bombs missed, but those didn't miss the target because they were aimed at the radar and the ammunition dumps, and they destroyed those. The one at the bottom was dropped by Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, and he received the Distinguished Flying Cross for that, having flown from Ascension, the longest bombing raid ever to take place at that time, since superseded by the Americans, of course. And he flew back to Ascension, very short of fuel, refueled by the Victors. Now, it required every Victor tanker that the RAF possessed to get the aircraft down there and back. And the pilot of the successful Victor, also the first Victor that refueled him, also received, I think, the DFC. Now, what else can I tell you about that? Oh, that is the best way to disable a runway, is across it like that, because the Argentinians flew their fast jets off very quickly and never flew them back to the Falklands again, because the runways were unstable after they'd been hit. Every time they filled up the craters subsided and they had to do it again. Now, this was more of a propaganda flight than anything else, because we convinced the Argentinians that if we could drop bombs on the Falklands from Ascension, we could also drop bombs on Argentina. So they flew their aircraft back to Argentina to protect the mainland. In order to get the aircraft down there, they had to what they call retrofit or refit the Vulcans with their in-flight refueling. Now, we tried in-flight refueling in the early 60s, but it wasn't terribly successful. In fact, I couldn't do it because I couldn't see the end of the nose probe from the cockpit, being too short, and many pilots had the same problem. But when they came to refit the refueling probes, one of the aircraft they found had got a valve missing. They searched high and low, and eventually it was found being used by the ground crew in one of their crew rooms as an ashtray. So they quickly took it out, sent it back to the manufacturers who refurbished it, fitted it back into the aircraft, and it worked absolutely perfectly. So that was happiness. When they were doing the practicing, they discovered that they hadn't got any maps of the South Atlantic. And rather than admitting it and going red-faced to the Navy and asking for some more, Alan, are you going to hand those beers round? Right. Rather than going red-faced to the Navy and saying, can we have some of your maps, because you know you've got a lot, they got maps of the North Atlantic, turned them upside down, renamed the Azores as the Falkland Islands, and practiced with those. Fortunately, the real maps arrived in time for the operational sorties, so they were able to re-equip them. Now, both those stories and many others are in a book called Vulcan 607, and if you haven't read it, I recommend it heartily to your reading. I have 1 or 2 copies left, and if people get in touch with me, we can do some sort of a financial deal, I'm sure. So that is the story of the Vulcan and the only times they would drop bombs in anger. We now move on to the history of the last flying Vulcan, which was Mark II Vulcan XH558, which, as it says here, first came into flight on 26th of May 1960, and it was moved into Vulcan service just 5 days later on the 5 weeks later on the 1st of July. It stayed until 1973 as a bomber aircraft at Waddington. Then it became a maritime radar reconnaissance aircraft. And the only difference really is the little bulb you can see on top of the tail. The aircraft was used as maritime radar reconnaissance over the North Sea to replace the aging Shackleton prior to the Nimrod coming into service. I believe it was very good because it was very stable, and you could have downward looking radar which would pick up any bogies from Russia or anywhere else, and it would also keep an eye open for shipping. 1973 to 1982, when she was modified back and used as a tanker. And you can see here this big square tail. Now, the Victor, which, as I said, was a very successful tanker, was what they call a 3-point tanker. And you could have two hoses trailing out of the wings and one from the tail. 3-point tanker could refuel 3 aircraft at once, provided they were fighters. The Vulcan could only refuel 1 aircraft, and that was because the only way they could get the hose out was through the tail. I have yet to find a pilot who flew the aircraft, but as I say, in this role, but as I say, the aircraft was very stable, and I have no reason to believe it was anything but good. Now, in 1984, some 2 years later, 558 was converted back to the bomber configuration, and it was used with 1 other aircraft for display service, and there were 2 aircraft doing displays. Sadly, in 1986, the other one was deemed at the end of its useful life, and it was then that 558 became the last Vulcan in RAF service, and it remained so until 1992, when the decision was made to scrap her, and she was put up for auction. She was bought by David Walton, who was a director of C. Walton Limited from Bruntingthorpe in Leicestershire, and he paid the magnificent sum of £30,000. The reason he paid so much was because this was the aircraft with the least flying hours used and more flying hours technically remaining, and he figured that he could get her back into flying service with a bit of help for a lot of money. Otherwise, this was what would have happened. Now, to be honest, this is XJ825 at Waddington, and she was used for fire practice and crew escape drills and things of that nature. And the Royal Air Force Regiment, who ran the fire service, got at her with their little axes, and eventually she all fell to pieces. The Vulcan Operating Company was formed in 1997. It took 5 years. And Dr. Robert Fleming, he's the only one who can afford a tie in this picture. He and the team began to create a proposal to return 558 to flight. When David Walton bought her, he paid £100,000 and he bought every spare part the Royal Air Force still had. And that included 8 engines in their crates, totally unused. And that was what gave him the idea that he could do this. The Vulcan Operating Company, unfortunately, suffered financial, the word I would use is shenanigans, and money disappeared. We don't know how, or maybe they do know how, but they did nothing about it. So nothing was really done with the aircraft until 1999, when at Bruntingthorpe, she did a final fast taxi run prior to restoration. In the background is a Victor, and those of you who took an interest in aviation at the time may know that this Victor at Bruntingthorpe was undergoing engine runs, because the engines were serviceable, on the end of the runway, held back by chops, with a group captain in the pilot's seat and an airman in the back. And all of a sudden, the group captain opened up the throttles to do his engine runs, opened them up too far, and the Victor jumped over the chops. Now, they were not terribly happy about that because it was not serviceable enough to fly. Fortunately, he was able to close the engines down before any serious damage was done. But he, like the wing commander I mentioned at Coningsby earlier, was never allowed near the aircraft again. Fortunately, the aircraft, as I say, came to a stop on the end of the runway and was then moved back to where she seems to be at this stage. In 2005, which you will know is now, I think, 6 years later, 558 is purchased for the nation and restoration recommences. Now, we have not been able to find out how much the trust, the Vulcan Sky Trust, paid for this aircraft, but rumour has it it was as much as £1. Fundraising started again with an appeal to the Heritage National Lottery Heritage Fund, and we asked them for £2.5 million. And the initial reaction was just like the Vicar of Dibley. There's a chap on there who says no, 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 yes. Well, they said no, 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 maybe. If you come up with a new resolution, a new catchphrase, a new line that the Vulcan is going to be used for the future education of children, we will reconsider. So they did, and they eventually said, yes, you can. We will give you 2.74 million. That was to account for the inflation over the time they took to make up their mind. So restoration commenced. Now, in this picture, you can see the engine, which is on the bit of framework in the bottom right. That's one of the engines. There are no engines in it. The tailplane has gone. The parachute hatch at the top there is open. That's for slowing the aircraft down on landing. And some of the radar equipment and the electronic equipment has come out of that hole in the bottom. That was 2005. In 2006, on the 31st of August, 558 rolled out at Bruntingthorpe. And those of you who can see it, on the undercarriage, port undercarriage door, they have painted thank you as a thank you to all the people who donated. And at that stage, the Vulcan of the Sky Trust had over 10,000 followers who contributed a lot of money. Now, the 2.74 million had not proved to be enough, so they needed another 500,000. So they've put out an appeal, and those 10,000 supporters turned out £500,000 in the space of less than a week. I think they must have been generous people, probably Freemasons. But that gave us enough money to get the aircraft finished. You can see the crowd that turned out just to see the aircraft. It was not going to go anywhere, no engines starting, nothing. Now that is the cockpit of the Vulcan. When they were originally designed, they were designed for one pilot. But because of the two-man verification system that the Americans insisted on, she was reconverted at the front to two pilots. And you can see here virtually identical instruments on both sides. She has a fighter control column, not like the old yoke that the Lancasters had, and this is because she handles like a fighter. At 40,000, 50,000 feet, this aircraft will turn inside the Lightning, which was the state-of-the-art fighter at the time. Judicious use of the control column, the air brakes and the engines will turn right inside a fighter. You can look out the window and you can see the Lightnings virtually falling out of the sky as they try to reach you. They can't do it. All the instruments, all the flying instruments are duplicated. Down the left-hand side that you can't see are the controls for the power flying controls, which are all electric and hydraulic. And down the right-hand side is all the heating and oxygen equipment. And in the middle, where you can see that red tag at the right at the bottom, is a retractable fuel panel. The aircraft has 14 fuel tanks, and by judicious transfer of fuel from one to another, you can balance the aircraft and keep the engines running while the balance of the aircraft stands neutral. The only thing wrong with that picture is, of course, the ejection seats have been removed. Now, the pilots had ejection seats, the rear crew did not, although there was a Mark III Vulcan designed with ejection seats for the rear crew, but it never came into production. On Thursday, October the 18th, 2007, after 5 years of spending money on her, 558 took to the air again. Flown by, on the left, Flight Lieutenant Alistair McDickin, in the middle, Squadron Leader David Thomas, the two pilots, and on the right, the Squadron Leader Barry Mayfield, the Air Electronics Officer. There were no navigators, because it was decided that it was cheaper to put a sat-nav in than to employ navigators. Just behind Dave Thomas's left shoulder, you can see a hatch with a yellow ladder on it. That's the entrance door. That yellow ladder folds down to let the crew in, and then when the aircraft cabin door is shut, the ladder unclips and is stowed away, so that if the rear crew have to get out while the aircraft is in the air, they open that door, which acts as a guard against the airflow, and slide down the door. Their parachutes are attached to a static line, and they can float away into the atmosphere. If, however, the nose wheel is down, and you can see the nose wheel there behind Barry Mayfield's right shoulder, that entrance door points straight at it. So you've got to practice swinging on one of these hydraulic rams that pushes the entrance door down to get yourself clear of that nose wheel. And the crews used to practice that on the ground every month during their flying career. Whether or not it actually worked, I don't know. But I don't know of any rear crew who actually had to get out while the wheels were down. So, 2008, the permit to fly was granted by the CAA. Now, for those who have heard this talk before, you know that CAA stands for the Campaign Against Aircraft. And their motto is, if we can think of a reason to stop you flying, we will use it. But they ran out of reasons by the 3rd of July 2008 and granted display authorization on the same day. The first public display was 2 days later. It was at RAF Waddington Air Show because Waddington was the traditional home of the Vulcan. More Vulcans flew out of Waddington than anywhere else. This is a picture of 558, and in the background you can see the crowds. Well, you can see their cars. It is said that on the day that the Vulcan flew and did a power climb at the end of the runway, 5,000 car alarms went off in that crowd. And I believe it. Now, I actually lived only about a quarter of a mile away from the runway, right over the back there at the top, were the married quarters, and I lived about 400 or 500 yards away, so we could hear it. You can see here the nose probe for the refueling, and you can see where it is. You can see how difficult it would be for the pilot, who's sitting in the left-hand seat at the front, to see the end of the nose probe. So they had to practice with somebody standing between the seats, guiding them into the nose probe, guiding them into the drogue, I should say. And I'll show you more of that in a minute. This shows you the new plan form rather than the almost distinct triangle that it started with. The aircraft here has quite a number of different curves on its wings. This is the Mark II Vulcan, and as you can, or may be able to tell, it's slightly bigger, but a lot stronger and a lot more aerodynamic with those wings. This is deliberately in to show you two things. First of all, again, you can see the nose probe relative to the cockpit. Secondly, well, there's three things really. Secondly, you can see on the top wing, on the left-hand side, there are two air brakes sticking up, and underneath, there's one underneath by the red light on each side. There are two on the other wing as well that you can't see, and those are the air brakes that you use when you're at height to help the turning circle reduce and to slow you down when you're coming into land. You can see the main wheel bogies there. There are 4 bogies on each main wheel undercarriage bogie with pairs of wheels on each, and it was one of those pairs of wheels that fell off at Coningsby and bounced over the aircraft. Now, this is a picture, comparison picture. This is not Go Compare or Confused.com or anything like that. It's a Lancaster at the front, going very fast, or as fast as it could, and the Vulcan going as slow as it can at the back. Now, this is, I say, a comparison flight. The reason for that is that these two aircraft have one thing in common, which a lot of people don't know about. They're both about the same size, just about 100 feet from tip to tip. Both heavy bombers, both made by Avro and both with 4 engines. But a lot of people don't realise that these two aircraft were both designed by the same person. They were designed by Roy Chadwick, the Lancaster in 1937, the Vulcan just 10 years later, came on the drawing board in 1947. Sadly, Chadwick didn't see this Vulcan fly because he was killed in an Avro Ashton accident just before the first one got airborne. But it shows the advances made in aviation design over the 10 years. This is just in for interest. It's the 558 in formation with the Barclays Bank, as they were then, blades. 4 aerobatic display aircraft flown by ex-RAF pilots, sponsored by Barclays. And when we used to have our big fundraising exercises, we had a summer draw, and this was, I think, one of the second prizes. I think first prize was a flight in a Spitfire alongside the Vulcan, and the second prize was a flight with the blades. I think it was a day with the blades as well. This is my favourite. team, and this is the Vulcan coming into land. Now I want you to watch how short the runway, the landing is. Just coming in on the right-hand side of the picture, you'll see the famous black sheds. Unfortunately, just as the starts put the nose down, they finish the picture. But you can see she doesn't need much of a landing strip. Now, I said that the National Heritage Lottery Fund gave us 2.74 million, and we changed our mission to inspire the next generation of scientists, engineers, designers and aviators. Now, one of the last times the Vulcan flew was at Manston in 2015, and from 7:30 in the morning on the Friday, there were coach loads of school children arriving and given guided tours of the aircraft underneath by aircrew. And every 15 minutes, a coach would arrive and disgorge all these kids. And here you see a picture of some of them. Now, you notice that all the people involved in the aircraft, or nearly all the people involved in the aircraft, have the same hairstyle that I have, and I can see John Vince has it, and there are one or two others as well. It is not a requirement to be a Vulcan pilot that you're going a bit thin on top. Martin Withers is the one looking to his left in the back row there, and there are several others as well. Now, what we have done in this is we have brought our finances to bear now to build this purpose-built hangar. Now, planning permission has only recently been given at what was RAF Finningley, which is now laughingly called the Robin Hood International Airport, Doncaster, Sheffield. Called Robin Hood because Doncaster and Sheffield were two places that Robin Hood never went to. But they will keep her in flying in the best possible condition and use her for fast taxi runs. Sadly, she can't fly anymore. She's been grounded because the campaign against aircraft said, we've won now, chaps. The servicing agents, who were Rolls-Royce, they were, forget the names now, Marshals of Cambridge and AV Row, have decided that they can no longer justify the expense of keeping their test equipment and renewing their test equipment and training new people to service the aircraft. We are running MVQ courses to allow the future generations to learn about the aircraft. They're going to learn pilot training, cabin crew training, air traffic control, ground handling, line engineering, dispatch, none of which sadly are involved with the aircraft. As it says there, to support other heritage aircraft around the UK and have an active build a plane initiative. They are building a plane that currently it's nearly finished. It'll undergo its flying trials and its CAA clearance soon, and it's being done mainly in conjunction with Air Training Corps cadets, and they will be the first ones to be given the opportunity to learn to fly it. And that's what the aircraft looks like. I believe it's about £85,000 to buy as a kit. And there we are. Known as the Spirit of Doncaster. So, when it last flew, our commentator who used to go around to all the air shows, a chap called Sean Maffett, said, "Don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened, and if that's too much, smile through the tears." And believe me, on the last day that 558 flew, there were tears. It was a very sad day, especially after we put so much effort into it. I started off giving my talks to raise some money to keep the aircraft, or to get the aircraft back into the air. At that time, I wanted to raise £1,500. A little later, I increased it to £5,000, and then I discovered that you could actually have a fly past for £10,000. By the time I got to £10,000, they put the price up to 15, and by the time I got £15,000, they put it up to 20, and by the time I got to 20, she was grounded. So there we are.
So we've been royally entertained by one of the best speakers in the business. Paddy is going to get a lovely little donation from the province to say thank you for his efforts. If you want to do the same, as I say, there's ways and means to do it. If you want to email me at apgm4@westkentmasons.org.uk, I can put you in touch with Paddy and he can arrange to get you a copy of his signed book if you prefer. But I think, Paddy, thank you so much for your time. You're never, ever, ever disappointing. You have entertained, informed, educated and kept us all amused for a good hour and a half. So thank you very much, sir. Congratulations.